He was a glorious stroke maker, perfectly balanced at the crease. He was an icon, an inspiration for his people. He overcame racism and the tyranny of distance to achieve greatness. Intelligent, astute and graceful, George Headley is one of ESPN's legends of cricket. In 1932, playing against a touring English first-class team, George Headley played what observers called the perfect innings, 344 not out.
In 1932, Lord Tennyson, the former England Test captain, brought a team to Jamaica and to the West Indies, and Headley slaughtered them. He scored an innings of 344 not out, and it's been described by those who saw it as the perfect innings. In the series, in the matches against the Tennyson side, he scored 723 runs, was only dismissed twice, lowest score 84, an average of 361 and a half. Tennyson, the captain, described it as being just the innings of perfection, and he also commented that Headley throughout that series just displayed a complete variety of strokes. I would imagine that George Headley in 1932 was a batsman as unlikely to be dismissed as any cricketer in the history of the game.
Headley was a small, finely constructed man who hit the ball with great power.
A little man, tiny man, but he had the eye. George Headley's eyes had something, had a sparkle. Most of the top batsmen have got great eyes. Their eyes show something in there, and you can recognise that something that makes them different.
What Grimmett has said and what Bradman has said about George Headley, that he was one of the greatest players the world's ever seen. Older West Indians say that he was the best ever from the West Indies. And I can believe them. I've only seen things of him on television, so I can't go into any detail on that, but people I trust say, look, that guy was absolutely magnificent.
He was very strong in every direction. His defence was splendid. He had a full range of shots, played the hook shot, and was particularly strong on the onside. Clarry Grimmett always said that he thought George Headley one of the greatest players that he ever bowled to. And of course, Clarry bowled to all the great players of that era, so his opinion ought to be respected. I rate George very highly indeed.
In Australia, his prolific run-getting earned him the title of the Black Bradman.
They called him the Black Bradman. Somebody said, well, Bradman was he was the White Headley.
You'd say Headley is the Black Bradman, and the guys in the Caribbean would say, no man, you got it wrong. Bradman's the White Headley. And so obviously he was, and I'm talking in the 1970s, and he basically finished by the war. I think he played 1 or 2 tests after the war, but he was past it by then. So, he'd basically finished by the end of the 30s, and here we are in the 70s, and people were still talking about George Headley and how good he was.
In his demeanour at the wicket, he was quite like Bradman. He's a compact figure. He moved his feet very quickly, played off the back foot a lot, but was capable of coming down the wicket. Very attractive, wristy, more attractive than Bradman to watch, more graceful and stylistic than Bradman, and very effective, a great deflector of the ball.
His statistics alone emphasise that he was a great batsman. He played in the 1930s when the West Indies had first come into Test cricket. He wasn't surrounded by any player who was of note, so he had to carry the batting on his own. He was known as Atlas in the Caribbean because of that fact. He carried the batting on his shoulders, and he averaged just over 60 in Test cricket. And between 1928, when the West Indies first came into Test cricket, and 1939, when the war broke out, the West Indies had scored 22 Test hundreds all told, and he had scored 10 of them. So he really was the dominant batsman, and people referred to him as a black Bradman. West Indians referred to Bradman as a white Headley.
Panama-born George Headley might have been a dentist in America had he not become smitten with the game of cricket.
In 1927, the great English batsman Ernest Tilsley came to the West Indies on a tour, and he was actually injured in a car accident midway through that tour, but in the first 3 matches he scored 100 in every game. And in Jamaica, where he got those runs, Headley saw him bat, and Headley commented years later that he watched every ball. And it was the way apparently that he said he watched every ball. There's no doubt that Headley was a very keen observer of other cricketers, and it's shown in his career that he learnt very, very quickly as to what to do.
Selected for Jamaica at the age of 18, Headley made 211 in his second match. Despite his obvious talent, he was overlooked for the West Indian team to tour England in 1928.
The West Indies went to England in 1928, and you can just imagine the politics of trying to pick the side when the selectors sit down and they've got all the class prejudices. They've got to pick their, if you like, their fellow whites. They've also got to fit in players from the different islands. It would have been almost impossible for a teenage black Jamaican, Jamaica being so far from the centre of West Indies cricket at the time, which was more centred around Barbados and Trinidad. It would have been almost impossible for a black Jamaican to make the side, and hence, despite Headley's undoubted talent, he did miss out and didn't go on that tour in 28, and that's why he then didn't make his Test debut until when Calthorpe's team came out in 1930. But then when he did make his Test debut, the impact he had was immediate and phenomenal.
On his debut in Barbados against England, Headley made 176.
He came into the Test match in Barbados, got I think it was 60 or 70 in the first innings, and then 100 in his very first Test match. And then he went on to Guyana, got hundreds there, and from that moment you know that Headley was going to be a great player.
In the final Test at home in Jamaica, Headley made 223 to save the match, becoming the youngest batsman to score a Test match double century.
He was at the time the youngest player to score a double century in Test cricket. The first teenager, I think Javed Miandad, then broke that record in around 1976. He's still at 223, is still the largest score by a cricketer in the 4th innings of a Test match. And for a bloke to achieve this in his first series is quite extraordinary.
To the black masses throughout the Caribbean, he had become a hero.
He's revered by all Jamaicans in Caribbean society of his era. It was harder to make your way to the top than it was if you were born the right colour and and fairly wealthy. So he was a real working man's hero.
George Headley was a big name in Jamaica. Still is a big name in Jamaica, the greatest cricketer Jamaica ever produced. And at that stage of Jamaica's development, when young black people in Jamaica were looking to make a mark in Jamaica and to say, here I am worth something, I can contribute to this society, George Headley stood out like a beacon.
I don't think we can underrate Headley's impact and importance to the history of Jamaican cricket. I think that for the modern cricket fan to see the influence of cricketers such as Sir Vivian Richards and Andy Roberts on the growth of cricket in Antigua, Headley is a similar figure to Jamaican cricket. He was, for the people of the island, the cricketers, black, white, whatever, I mean, Headley was the game's first superstar there, but especially for the black lower classes to have a hero such as George Headley. And he was that hero from the moment he scored a double century against England.
In 1931, the West Indies travelled to Australia to face a team brimming with confidence after Bradman's triumphs on the 1930 tour of England. 2 players made more than 1,000 first-class runs that season. Don Bradman and George Headley. It was during this series Headley was dubbed the Black Bradman.
George Headley had a fine tour, did very well, and subsequently improved on that form as his career unfolded. And history would undoubtedly rank George Headley as one of the all-time great batsmen, and he was certainly a great player.
Well, the history books tell you a lot about George Headley, and people used to refer to him as Atlas, because he was pretty much the man that held up the West Indies team. If the West Indies got 220 runs, George Headley got 120, 130 out of that. And he did that on a regular basis.
Headley had arrived in Australia as a predominantly offside batsman, and Australian leg spinner Clarry Grimmett had a plan.
He scored 100 in Melbourne against Victoria in an early tour match. And after that game, Hugh Trumbull, who was a former Australian cricketer and was the secretary of the Melbourne Cricket Club, said it was one of the best hundreds that he'd ever seen. But then word got out to the Australian team, Woodfull was the Victorian captain, and word got out that they worked out how to bowl at Headley. And Clarry Grimmett was their key, and he concentrated on Headley's leg stump. And Headley hardly scored a run in the first 2 tests. But then in the 3rd test, he realised that he had to teach himself how to play on the leg side, and most specifically to get an on-drive. So he went into the nets and he just practiced and practiced and practiced, and there are quotes from his teammates saying that he would practice for hours and hours just learning how to play the on-drive. And so he came out for the 3rd test and scored 100, and it was recognised as one of the best hundreds that the critics had seen. And by the end of the series, Grimmett himself and Johnny Moyes, who was the leading Australian journalist at the time, and Herbert Collins, the former Australian captain, all said that Headley was the best onside player that they'd ever seen.
At the end of the tour, he was considered one of the best onside players they'd seen. He was adaptable. You see pictures of him, still pictures. I've only seen a little bit of clips of him, but he went right back. He used the crease. When he pulled with his back foot almost behind the stumps. And when he went forward, he went right forward. And that's the hallmark of a really great player. But he dominated West Indies cricket, and of course he led the way for the great batsmen who were to follow.
In 1935, England toured the West Indies for the 2nd time. The first test was played on a substandard pitch, with Headley and Hammond playing extraordinary knocks in a low-scoring match.
He was almost at his best on wet wickets. Headley was a man of extraordinary ability when things were difficult. I think he's probably up there with Hammond, and might even have been a better bat than Hammond. There's been a comparison done between Headley and Bradman on wet wickets, which showed that on 13 innings on wet wickets, Headley got 57 times. Bradman had played 14 innings on wet wickets and got 50 once.
Bradman on wet wickets wasn't overly successful. Headley on wet wickets had to be the man, and so his record on wet wickets is quite extraordinary. And there are a number of people who saw Headley on wet wickets say he was the greatest wet wicket player ever. And these people would have seen Hobbs on wet wickets and Hammond on wet wickets, and yet they suggest that Headley was number 1.
With the series level, Headley made 270 not out in the last test in Jamaica. The West Indies won the match and the series, the first series win by a West Indian team against England, and their spearhead, George Headley, had become a folk hero.
Being from Jamaica and being a black man in Jamaica at that time, and having to go to England and travel all over the place and to still achieve what he achieved, I think that even puts more onus on the fact that he was a great man and on his abilities, not just as a cricketer, but to overcome all the other peripheral things that would have affected his life.
For the 1939 tour of England, many believed that George Headley should be the West Indian captain.
It's a shame he couldn't have been captain earlier. I think he knew an enormous amount about the game. He knew everything about the game. West Indies cricket politics stopped him from being captain when, you know, he probably could have made his biggest contribution to the game.
His contemporaries, to a man, suggest he would have been a superb captain. And just he became a statesman after he retired, so he clearly had the ability to communicate with his teammates. And the fact that he was such a great observer of opposition players, which he then applied to his own cricket, suggests that he would have been an excellent tactician as well.
England won the series, but Headley was now universally recognised as one of the world's greatest batsmen. He was known as Atlas because of the way he carried the West Indian side.
Yeah, George Headley was also known as Atlas, which quite simply because it was recognised that he carried the West Indies cricket world on his shoulders. He was as clear-cut an example in cricket history of a man carrying his side. The closest recent analogy I could think of would be Richard Hadley carrying the New Zealand bowling attack, or perhaps Alan Border with the Australian batting in the 80s. But I think George Headley was more so than either of those. He really was the ultimate one-man band.
Within days of the series ending, the world was at war, and George Headley's greatest days were over. After the war, George Headley was made captain for the 1948 home series against England, an extraordinary achievement for a black cricketer.
It was a great honour for somebody black in those days because, they probably thought that we didn't, the leaders, the black people were not very good leaders, and for him to be elevated to that position was a landmark for West Indies cricket.
In 1954, Headley, who had been coaching and playing league cricket in England, came home for his last test.
Headley's status as a man and as a cricketer in Jamaica is still around. The main grandstand at Sabina Park is the George Headley stand, and probably the greatest example of just how highly he's regarded there came in the 53-54 series, when Headley had been playing league cricket in England and hadn't played a test match since 1948.
The public in Jamaica actually had an appeal to try and get him back to the Caribbean to play in the series in 1953-54 against Len Hutton's side, even though at that time he was 45 and coaching and playing league cricket in England. There was a public subscription which raised over £1,000 and they brought him back to play in that series, but of course at the age of 45 he really was past his best. But that gives an illustration of the regard in which he was held and the quality of the player that he was.
People wanted George Headley back in Jamaica to again lead the way. So our youngsters could look up on George Headley and said, if this man can achieve so much, so can I. He was supposed to be a role model. People wanted him back there so he could continue that role. People didn't want him in England, far away from Jamaica. No youngsters in Jamaica being able to get close to him to see what he was achieving and to believe that they could achieve as well. So that is why they had this big campaign to get him back home, even at that age. He certainly couldn't have produced his best at that age, but just to have him around was a big thing for the people of Jamaica.
All who met the great man were left with a lasting impression.
I met George in '81 and I'm so glad that I did. I spent the day with him in Bridgetown watching a test match. He had a great sense of humour, but he also had a sense of fair play, and one of the English batsmen, Gower or Willie, was given out to a patently poor decision, and George said to me, "Man, that spoils it for me." And I was impressed by that because it showed that unlike everyone around us, he wasn't being one-eyed about it. He cherished cricket. Cricket had given him a lot, and he'd given a lot to cricket.
I had the opportunity to meet George Headley once. We were at a function at the Kingston Cricket Club at the ground at Sabina Park. I've been just talking to George for a couple of minutes, and I realised that he was very interesting to talk to him about cricket, but he was also quite a character, and he had interesting stories to tell. And it's a very fond cricketing memory of the night that I had a long chat with George Headley.
George, a very nice guy. He's had sons and grandsons playing English county cricket. But very nice guy and extremely modest about his own performances.
I spent a little bit of time with him. When you have someone like George Headley and you're a youngster, you're a teenager, you tend to stay in the background and try and listen to what is happening around him. So that was my early contact with him. But at the same time, early in my life, I won an award at Melbourne at the prize giving ceremony, at the presentation dinner. They asked George Headley to give me my prize, which was one of the greatest things that ever happened to me. When George Headley handed me whatever I was getting, I wasn't even focusing on what I was getting. I was focusing on the fact that George Headley was giving me my prize. It meant so much to me. What meant even more to me was perhaps a few days later or a week or so after. He then presented me with a picture of him handing me my prize. On the back of that picture he had written, "Play cricket and see the world." Now, I have played cricket, I have seen the world.
Headley died in 1983, remembered as one of the finest batsmen of any era, and the man who carried West Indian cricket in those difficult early years.
Headley was the first of the great West Indies batsmen. He set the pattern for those who followed, so that after the war, in the interterritorial tournaments back home, you had the 3Ws coming through, you had J.K. Holt from Jamaica. He set the example, George Headley, and the rest then followed. So he was the one who led the way.
George Headley played 22 test matches, scoring 2,190 runs. He averaged 60.83. Only Don Bradman and Graham Pollock finished with higher averages. Leaving out his 3 post-war tests, his average was 64.7. He earned his nickname Atlas for scoring 10 of the first 14 centuries made by West Indian batsmen. And in the 35 innings in which he batted before the war, he top-scored on 15 occasions.
I think he lost his best years to the war. The war deprived him of a lot of great years where he could have made a lot more runs and perhaps have even a better record, but his record is great anyway.
I still regard him as probably the greatest West Indian batsman, for the simple reason that he didn't have the support that later great batsmen from the Caribbean had. He did it almost single-handed, and he made 10 test centuries in 20 test matches. Unfortunately, he came back after the war when he was past it, but if you look at his record during the 1930s, late 20s to the war, he was fantastic. He made 100 in each innings in a test at Lords against a good England attack. Very small man, nimble on his feet, big appetite for runs, and to get to meet him and to, for once, not to be let down, because often you meet the great performers and they do disappoint you, but I'm proud of that day I spent with George.
Had he played in the modern era, he would certainly have been the West Indian captain, and he would have played many more test matches. But a strong case can be argued that of all the glorious batsmen to have graced West Indian cricket, George Headley was the greatest. For his talent, his intelligence, and his grace in the face of injustice, George Headley is one of ESPN's legends of cricket.